In the sweltering heat of July 2013, something was rotting in East Cleveland. The putrid stench that hung in the air like a toxic cloud would soon reveal one of Ohio's most disturbing serial murder cases.
Right now, I guess we're supposed to, in our hearts, forgive this clown who's touched our families, taken my child.
He's looking directly at Madison.
Oh, it was heart-wrenching. It was frustrating to just sit there and to see the facial expression, to know that he was that angry.
Were you surprised that he had done that?
I was very surprised when it happened. I could understand why he did it, not that he planned to do any of it, but when he heard that his daughter was mutilated, that was the part that was difficult for him.
Van passed away in February of this year.
Yeah.
How was he doing with regard to the loss of your daughter?
He never healed. You know, that was something that he was not ever able to comprehend of why. It was something that he could never get over. You know how people always say that time heals all wounds? When you lose a child, time doesn't heal that wound.
Michael Madison wasn't your typical serial killer. Born into a world of violence and neglect on October 15, 1977, he emerged from a childhood so traumatic that it would later be used as his defense team's primary argument for mercy. But mercy is a luxury victims don't receive, and Madison's three known victims, Angela Deskins, Shetisha Sheeley, and Shirellda Terry, would discover just how merciless their killer could be. The story begins not with Madison's first murder, but with the discovery that would unravel his entire operation. On July 19, 2013, frustrated neighbors finally called police about an overwhelming smell of decomposition coming from a rented garage in their deteriorating neighborhood. When officers broke down the door, they found a sight that would haunt them forever: a naked female body, bound and wrapped in the fetal position, sealed within multiple layers of garbage bags. Within hours, investigators traced the garage rental to one name: Michael Madison. The 35-year-old registered sex offender lived just blocks away in a second-floor apartment above a vacant storefront. As police obtained search warrants and mobilized their resources, Madison was already planning his next move. What they didn't know was that this discovery was just the beginning of a horrific crime scene that would stretch across multiple locations and claim at least 3 lives. The methodical way the body had been disposed of, carefully wrapped, positioned, and concealed, suggested this wasn't Madison's first victim. Investigators knew they were dealing with someone who had perfected his technique through practice. The question wasn't whether there were more bodies, but how many more they would find. As news of the discovery spread through East Cleveland's tight-knit community, families of missing women began calling police with a mixture of hope and dread. For months, loved ones had been searching for daughters, sisters, and mothers who had vanished without explanation. Now those missing person reports would take on a terrifying new significance. The hunt for Michael Madison was about to begin, and what investigators would uncover would shake the community to its core. This is the story of how one man's hatred transformed him into a killing machine, and how the smell of death finally brought justice to East Cleveland. To understand the monster Michael Madison became, you must first understand the hell he emerged from. His childhood reads like a blueprint for creating a serial killer, a textbook case of how systematic abuse can twist a young mind into something unrecognizable and dangerous. Born to Diane Madison, a woman who had herself been abandoned by her drug-addicted mother, Michael never knew his biological father. John Baldwin denied paternity and vanished from their lives, leaving Diane to raise her son alone. But Diane's idea of parenting was shaped by her own traumatic upbringing, creating a cycle of abuse that would span generations. The violence began early. When Michael was just 2 years old, His mother force-fed him until he vomited, then plunged him into scalding water as punishment for being sick. When he screamed from the burns, she beat him with an extension cord. This wasn't discipline. This was torture, and it was just the beginning. Diane's revolving door of boyfriends brought new forms of abuse. These men, temporary fixtures in Michael's life, seemed to compete in their cruelty. One boyfriend beat the toddler so severely with a belt that Michael suffered permanent hearing loss in one ear and required hospitalization. When social workers examined him, they found something even more disturbing: evidence of sexual abuse. The Department of Child and Family Services finally intervened, but their solution was almost as damaging as the original problem. They placed Michael with his grandmother, a former prostitute and heroin addict who continued the cycle of neglect and abuse. It was a classic case of removing a child from one dangerous situation only to place him in another. When Michael was eventually returned to his mother's care, nothing had changed. The beatings continued, the neglect persisted, and the hatred festered. By age 16, Michael had developed what he would later describe as a complete hatred of women. He blamed the female gender for his suffering, creating a twisted worldview that would ultimately drive him to kill. His adolescence was marked by increasingly violent behavior. At 17, he was charged with inappropriately touching a classmate, an early indicator of the sexual violence that would define his adult crimes. At 20, drug charges landed him in jail, where he began to understand the power he could wield through intimidation and violence. The pattern was clear. Michael Madison was learning to hurt others as a way of reclaiming control over his own pain. What started as a survival mechanism in childhood was evolving into something far more sinister. The boy who had been victimized was transforming into the man who would victimize others. By 2001, Madison's hatred had crystallized into action. He dragged an 18-year-old woman behind a house and attempted to rape her, only stopping when police arrived. The 4-year prison sentence he received included mandatory treatment for sex offenders, but rehabilitation was never Madison's goal. He was simply learning to be more careful, more methodical, and more dangerous. Prison changed Michael Madison, but not in the way society hoped. Instead of rehabilitation, he found refinement, learning to mask his violent impulses behind a facade of normalcy that would make him far more dangerous upon release. By 2005, he had served his time for attempted rape and returned to East Cleveland with a new understanding of how to avoid detection. Madison's post-prison life was carefully constructed to provide maximum freedom while maintaining minimal oversight. He registered his mother's address on the sex offender registry instead of his own, giving him mobility while appearing compliant. He established himself as a small-time drug dealer, a profession that provided both income and access to vulnerable women who might not be immediately missed if they disappeared. The man who emerged from prison was calculating and manipulative. Madison had learned to present himself as charming and attentive, qualities that would prove devastatingly effective in luring victims. He didn't hunt randomly. He selected women who were isolated, struggling, or desperate. His victims weren't chosen for their beauty or status, but for their vulnerability. In September 2012, Madison convinced a woman named Brittany Darby to move in with him. But this wasn't a romantic relationship. It was a cover operation. Almost immediately after Brittany moved in, Madison announced he wanted an open relationship and began seeing another woman, Shanta Mahone. Brittany was relegated to the guest room, unknowingly serving as Madison's alibi while he began his killing spree. The timing wasn't coincidental. September 2012 marked the beginning of Madison's murder campaign, starting with 28-year-old Shetisha Sheeley. Shetisha was a devoted mother to a 12-year-old daughter and maintained close relationships with her family. On the day she disappeared, she had called her mother to arrange borrowing money, but she never arrived for their meeting. Shetisha's disappearance initially didn't raise immediate alarm. Her lifestyle had been somewhat unstable, and family members initially assumed she had simply moved on without notice. This reaction was exactly what Madison had counted on, victims whose absence wouldn't immediately trigger intensive investigations. Next came 38-year-old Angela Deskins in June 2013. Angela was a student at Cuyahoga County Community College who listed herself as self-employed in customer service. Her family reported her missing, but in a community where people frequently moved without notice, missing person reports often received limited attention. Madison was exploiting the harsh reality that some victims are mourned more publicly than others. The final known victim was 18-year-old Shirellda Terry, who vanished on July 10, 2013. Shirellda had been working a summer job at a Cleveland elementary school when she disappeared. Unlike the previous victims, Shirellda's disappearance immediately triggered intensive searching. Her father, Larry Terry, flooded the streets with missing person posters and refused to accept that his daughter had simply vanished. Throughout this period, Brittany Darby continued living in Madison's apartment, completely unaware that she was sleeping just rooms away from decomposing bodies. Madison's ability to compartmentalize his crimes while maintaining normal relationships demonstrated a level of psychological control that made him particularly dangerous. The predator had perfected his craft, but he was about to make the mistake that would destroy everything. What makes Michael Madison's crimes particularly chilling isn't just the murders themselves, but the calculated way he continued his daily life while surrounded by death. For months, he lived with decomposing bodies, maintained relationships, and presented himself as a functioning member of society. This wasn't the behavior of someone who had killed in a moment of passion. This was the methodical routine of a predator who had learned to normalize horror. Brittany Darby's testimony would later reveal the disturbing reality of living with Madison during his killing spree. In early July 2013, she began noticing an increasingly powerful smell of decay permeating their apartment. The odor was so overwhelming that it was affecting her ability to sleep and function normally. When she finally confronted Madison about the smell, his response was both creative and revealing. 2 raccoons died in the hall closet, Madison explained with disturbing casualness. When Brittany moved toward the closet to investigate, Madison quickly blocked her path. "You don't want to see that," he warned. "It's gruesome." The fact that Madison could deliver this lie while knowing that Shetisha Sheeley's body was decomposing just feet away demonstrates the depth of his psychological detachment. But Madison's performance was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The smell was growing stronger, and neighbors were beginning to notice. He was forced to relocate Shetisha's body from the apartment closet to a more remote location. Years later, during police interrogation, Madison would describe the horrific process of moving the corpse, the boom 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 sound the garbage bag made as he dragged it down the stairs, a sound that would haunt investigators. The logistics of Madison's crimes reveal careful planning and a complete lack of empathy. He wasn't killing in moments of uncontrolled rage. He was methodically selecting, murdering, and disposing of victims while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Each body was carefully wrapped in multiple layers of garbage bags, positioned in the fetal position, and hidden in locations that would delay discovery. Madison's choice of disposal sites wasn't random. He selected locations within a confined area near his apartment, places where he could monitor potential discovery, while maintaining easy access if bodies needed to be moved. The garage where the first body was found was rented specifically for this purpose, giving Madison a controlled environment for his crimes. Meanwhile, the families of his victims were living in agony. Shetisha Sheeley's mother, Kamida, was dealing with the double trauma of her daughter's disappearance and her son's murder in an unrelated home invasion. When Shetisha failed to appear at her brother's funeral, the family's worst fears began to crystallize. Angela Deskins' family was frantically searching for any trace of their missing daughter. Shirellda Terry's father was plastering missing person posters throughout Cleveland, refusing to accept that his daughter had simply vanished. As the summer of 2013 progressed, Madison's careful control was beginning to crack. The smell was becoming impossible to ignore, neighbors were asking questions, and the heat was accelerating decomposition. The predator who had successfully hidden his crimes for months was about to be exposed by the very evidence he had tried so hard to conceal. July 19, 2013, began like any other day in East Cleveland, but it would end with the discovery that would bring Michael Madison's reign of terror to a sudden and decisive conclusion. The stench that had been building for weeks finally became unbearable, forcing neighbors to take action that would unravel one of Ohio's most disturbing serial murder cases. When police broke into the rented garage and found the first body, they immediately recognized they were dealing with something far more complex than a simple homicide. The methodical way the victim had been wrapped, positioned, and concealed suggested this was the work of someone with experience, someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. The name Michael Madison appeared on the garage rental agreement, immediately focusing the investigation on the registered sex offender living nearby. But Madison wasn't at his apartment when police arrived. He had fled to his mother's house, perhaps sensing that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. What followed was a 2-hour standoff that ended with Madison's arrest and the beginning of one of the most extensive crime scene investigations in Cleveland's history. The search that followed the arrest revealed the true scope of Madison's crimes. Within 24 hours, investigators had discovered 2 additional bodies in locations near the original garage. One victim was found in a nearby field, another in the basement of an abandoned house. All 3 bodies showed the same methodical disposal pattern, wrapped in multiple layers of garbage bags, positioned in the fetal position, and hidden in locations that would delay discovery. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. When police announced they were conducting a comprehensive search of the area, over 100 volunteers appeared to help investigate vacant and abandoned buildings throughout the neighborhood. The mobilization revealed both the community's determination to find justice and their collective fear about what else might be hidden in their midst. During his interrogation, Madison made a statement that sent chills through the investigation team. He mentioned Anthony Sowell, the Cleveland Strangler, who had murdered 11 women in the same area just years earlier. Investigators began to wonder if Madison had been inspired by Sowell's crimes, perhaps seeing them as a template for his own killing spree. The parallels between Madison and Sowell were disturbing. Both were registered sex offenders who had targeted vulnerable women in the same East Cleveland neighborhood. Both had methodically disposed of bodies in ways designed to delay discovery. Both had continued their normal lives while surrounded by decomposing corpses. The question that haunted investigators was whether Madison was a copycat killer or if there was something about East Cleveland that attracted this type of predator. Madison's eventual confession provided some answers, but raised new questions. He admitted to killing Shetisha Sheeley and described strangling her to death, but claimed he couldn't remember killing the other 2 victims. This selective memory wasn't unusual among serial killers, who often compartmentalize their crimes to maintain psychological stability. The investigation revealed that Madison had spent months living with death, moving bodies when necessary, and maintaining relationships while hiding his true nature. His ability to function normally while committing these crimes demonstrated a level of psychological control that made his eventual capture even more significant. The trial of Michael Madison began on April 4, 2016, bringing together the families of his victims, the community he had terrorized, and the justice system that would ultimately decide his fate. What emerged during the proceedings was a portrait of a man who had methodically planned and executed murders, while showing no remorse for the lives he had destroyed. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Madison had confessed to killing Shetisha Sheeley, describing in detail how he had strangled her and then lived with her decomposing body in his apartment for months. Physical evidence linked him to all 3 crime scenes, and witness testimony revealed his pattern of targeting vulnerable women who wouldn't be immediately missed. The defense team attempted to use Madison's traumatic childhood as grounds for an insanity plea, arguing that the systematic abuse he had suffered had created a mental illness that made him unable to control his actions. They presented evidence of the horrific violence Madison had endured as a child, the sexual abuse he had suffered, and the complete lack of stable relationships that had defined his early life. But the prosecution countered with evidence of Madison's calculated behavior. This wasn't someone who had snapped in a moment of uncontrolled rage. This was a predator who had carefully selected victims, methodically disposed of bodies, and maintained elaborate deceptions to avoid detection. The planning and forethought that went into his crimes contradicted any claim of mental incapacity. The jury deliberated for a remarkably short time before finding Madison guilty on all 14 counts. including 3 counts of aggravated murder, 3 counts of kidnapping, 3 counts of gross abuse to a corpse, 1 count of rape, and 1 count of weapons possession by a convicted felon. The verdict was unanimous and decisive. During the sentencing phase, the families of Madison's victims finally had their opportunity to confront the man who had destroyed their lives. The most powerful moment came when Shirellda Terry's father, Larry, took the stand to deliver his victim impact statement. As he spoke about the pain of losing his daughter, Madison began smiling, a display of callousness that would have tragic consequences. Larry Terry's reaction was immediate and understandable. Seeing his daughter's killer smirking while he described his grief, Terry lunged across the courtroom toward Madison. Court officers quickly intervened, pulling Terry away before he could reach Madison. The incident perfectly captured the raw emotion and overwhelming sense of injustice that had driven the case from the beginning. On May 20th, 2016, the jury recommended the death penalty for Michael Madison. The judge accepted their recommendation, sentencing Madison to death for the murders of Angela Deskins, Shetisha Sheeley, and Shirellda Terry. The sentence was later unanimously upheld by the Ohio Supreme Court, which found that the aggravating circumstances of Madison's crimes clearly outweighed any mitigating factors. Madison's appeals have been consistently denied, and as of 2024, he remains on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution. The case that began with the smell of death in East Cleveland had finally reached its legal conclusion, but the emotional impact on the families and community continues to this day. The conviction and sentencing of Michael Madison marked the end of his legal proceedings, but not the end of his story's impact on those he left behind. The families of his victims, the community of East Cleveland, and the broader justice system all continued to grapple with the consequences of his crimes long after the courtroom doors closed. For the families of Angela Deskins, Shetisha Sheeley, and Shirellda Terry, Madison's death sentence provided a form of justice, but it could never restore what had been lost. Each family faced the unique challenges of grieving for a loved one whose life had been cut short by senseless violence. The public nature of the crimes meant their grief was conducted under media scrutiny, adding another layer of difficulty to an already unbearable situation. Shetisha Sheeley's mother, Kamida, faced the particularly devastating combination of losing both her daughter and her son within months of each other. Having to identify her daughter's remains after months of hoping she was still alive somewhere represented a trauma that would affect her for the rest of her life. The strength she showed throughout the investigation and trial became an inspiration to others dealing with similar losses. Shirellda Terry's father, Larry, became an advocate for missing persons cases, using his experience to help other families navigate the difficult process of searching for missing loved ones. The fact that 2 serial killers had operated in the same area within such a short time frame raised questions about what factors made the community vulnerable to this type of predator. Investigators noted that both Madison and Sowell had targeted women who were struggling with addiction, poverty, or other life challenges, women whose disappearances were less likely to trigger immediate, intensive investigations. In a tragic epilogue to the Madison story, his mother Diane was murdered in 2019 by an intruder who stabbed her and 3 children in her home. The irony that the woman who had helped create a killer through her abuse ultimately became a victim of violence herself was not lost on those who had followed the case. The cycle of violence that had defined Madison's childhood had continued, claiming another generation of victims. The Michael Madison case serves as a stark reminder of how childhood trauma can create monsters, but also how the justice system must hold individuals accountable for their actions, regardless of their backgrounds. While Madison's horrific upbringing helps explain his development into a killer, it does not excuse the choices he made as an adult to take the lives of 3 innocent women. Today, Madison remains on death row, his appeals exhausted, his fate sealed. The families of his victims continue to rebuild their lives while carrying the permanent scars of his crimes. The case stands as a testament to both the devastating impact of serial murder and the resilience of those who survive in its aftermath.